Socrates on Freedom, the examined life as true liberation. Introduction. Socrates, the enigmatic Athenian philosopher who wrote nothing himself, yet transformed Western philosophy, offers a profound and challenging conception of freedom that continues to resonate in contemporary thought. Unlike many of his contemporaries who equated freedom with political liberty or the absence of external constraints, Socrates cultivated a more nuanced understanding of freedom as an internal state, one achieved through rigorous self-examination, moral autonomy, and the pursuit of knowledge. In this exploration, we will delve into Socrates' multifaceted conception of freedom as it emerges through Plato's dialogues. We will examine how Socrates' understanding of freedom relates to his dialectical method, his moral philosophy, and his political context. Through his confrontation with Athenian democracy, his rejection of conventional wisdom, and ultimately his acceptance of death rather than exile, Socrates embodied a radical conception of freedom that transcends mere political liberty to encompass intellectual and moral self-determination. As we navigate Socrates' thought on freedom, we must remember that our access to his ideas comes primarily through the writings of others, particularly his student Plato. While scholars debate the extent to which the Socrates of Plato's dialogues represents the historical figure, the Socratic vision of freedom that emerges from these texts has profoundly influenced philosophical thought for over 2 millennia. Historical context. Athens in the age of Socrates. To understand Socrates' conception of freedom, we must first situate him within the political and social environment of Athens during the 5th century BCE, a tumultuous period marked by imperial expansion, democratic innovation, cultural flourishing, and ultimately, defeat and disillusionment. Athenian democracy and its tensions. Socrates lived during the golden age of Athenian democracy, a radical experiment in direct citizen rule that granted unprecedented political rights to free, adult male citizens. The Athenian democratic system, refined under the leadership of Pericles, included institutions such as the assembly, ecclesia, where citizens voted directly on policy, the council, boule, which prepared the assembly's agenda, and the people's courts, dicasteria, where large juries of citizens rendered judgments. This democratic system embodied a particular conception of freedom, eleutheria, that emphasized citizens' rights to participate in governance and to live as one pleases within the boundaries of law. As Pericles declares in his famous funeral oration, as recorded by Thucydides, the freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. There, far from exercising a jealous surveillance over each other, we do not feel called upon to be angry with our neighbor for doing what he likes. Yet Athenian democracy contained inherent tensions and limitations. It excluded women, slaves, and resident foreigners, metics, from political participation. Its direct majoritarian character meant that it lacked robust protections for individual rights against the will of the majority. And its reliance on rhetoric in political decision-making raised questions about whether policy reflected wisdom or merely persuasive speaking. The Peloponnesian War and its aftermath. Much of Socrates' adult life was overshadowed by the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. This devastating conflict strained Athenian democracy, leading to increasing polarization, moral compromise, and eventually defeat. The war's aftermath included 2 brief periods of oligarchic rule, the 404-11 BCE and the 30 tyrants in 404 to 403 BCE, the latter of which included Socrates' former students Critias and Charmides. Although Socrates did not actively support these oligarchic regimes, and indeed risked his life by refusing the 30 tyrants' order to arrest a fellow citizen, his associations with figures who opposed democracy contributed to post-war suspicions about his loyalty to democratic principles. Intellectual and cultural context. Socrates emerged as a philosophical figure during a period of intellectual ferment in Athens. The city had become a center for sophists, itinerant teachers who, for a fee, taught rhetoric and other practical skills for success in public life. These sophists, including figures like Protagoras and Gorgias, often embraced moral and epistemological relativism, encapsulated in Protagoras' famous claim that man is the measure of all things. Simultaneously, Athens experienced a flourishing of artistic and cultural expression, from the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides to the comedies of Aristophanes, who lampooned Socrates in his play The Clouds. This cultural environment facilitated open discussion of fundamental questions about justice, knowledge, and the good life, discussions in which Socrates was an active and often provocative participant. The Socratic method and intellectual freedom central to Socrates' conception of freedom is his distinctive approach to philosophical inquiry, the dialectical method or elenchus, through which he sought to liberate himself and others from false knowledge and conventional wisdom. Socratic ignorance as freedom. Socrates' famous claim to wisdom paradoxically involved his awareness of his own ignorance. As he recounts in Plato's Apology, "I am wiser than this man, for neither of us really knows anything fine and good, but this man thinks he knows something when he does not, whereas I, as I do not know anything, do not think I do either. I seem, then, in just this little thing to be wiser than this man at any rate, that what I do not know, I do not think I know either." This stance of Socratic ignorance represents a form of intellectual freedom, freedom from the constraints of presumed knowledge, and the closure it brings to inquiry. By acknowledging his ignorance, Socrates remains open to new insights and free to question what others accept uncritically. The elenchus as liberation. Socrates' dialectical method, the elenchus, functioned as a tool for intellectual liberation. Through persistent questioning, Socrates helped his interlocutors recognize contradictions in their beliefs, thereby freeing them from the false confidence of unexamined opinions. The elenchus typically followed a pattern. Socrates would ask his interlocutor to define a moral concept, e.g., justice, courage, piety. He would then question this definition, revealing inconsistencies. Finally, the interlocutor would reach aporia, perplexity, recognizing that their presumed knowledge was illusory. This process, while often frustrating for Socrates' interlocutors, aimed at their intellectual liberation. As Socrates suggests in the Apology, the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. Through the elenchus, Socrates sought to free people from the tyranny of unexamined assumptions and to awaken them to the pursuit of genuine knowledge. Freedom from rhetoric and manipulation. Socrates consistently distinguished his dialectical approach from rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking central to Athenian political life. While rhetoricians aimed to persuade regardless of truth, Socrates sought truth regardless of persuasive effect. In Gorgias, Socrates condemns rhetoric as a form of flattery that appeals to pleasure rather than promoting what is truly good. By rejecting rhetoric in favor of dialectic, Socrates advocates for a form of intellectual freedom that resists manipulation through persuasive speech. This distinction had political implications. Athenian democracy relied heavily on rhetorical skill in assembly debates and court proceedings. By questioning the value of rhetoric, Socrates implicitly challenged whether democratic deliberation, as practiced in Athens, genuinely fostered freedom or merely created the illusion of autonomous choice while actually manipulating citizens through persuasive speaking. Moral autonomy and self-mastery beyond intellectual liberation, Socrates conceived of freedom in terms of moral autonomy and self-mastery, the capacity to govern one's actions according to reason rather than being driven by appetites, fears, or social pressures. Knowledge and virtue central to Socratic ethics is the claim that knowledge is necessary and sufficient for virtue. This position, sometimes called Socratic intellectualism, suggests that people only act wrongly out of ignorance. As Socrates argues in Protagoras, no one goes willingly toward the bad or what he believes to be bad. Neither is it in human nature, so it seems to want to go toward what one believes to be bad instead of to the good. This view has profound implications for freedom. If wrongdoing stems from ignorance rather than willful malice, then moral education liberates people to choose what is truly good. The person who knows what is good necessarily chooses it, and is thus free from the internal compulsion of misguided desires. Self-mastery as freedom. Socrates frequently discusses freedom in terms of self-mastery, enkrateia, control over one's appetites and passions through reason. In Gorgias, he contrasts the undisciplined person, whose soul is like a leaky jar unable to retain satisfaction, with the self-controlled person, whose moderation brings genuine freedom and happiness. This emphasis on self-mastery appears throughout Plato's dialogues. In Phaedo, Socrates describes how the philosopher practices for death by liberating the soul from bodily demands. The soul of the true philosopher abstains from pleasures and desires and pains as far as possible. This discipline is not mere asceticism, but freedom from domination by bodily needs. Freedom from fear of death. Perhaps the ultimate expression of Socratic freedom is liberation from the fear of death. Throughout his trial and imprisonment, Socrates displays remarkable equanimity, rooted in his conviction that no evil can happen to a good man, either in life or after death. In Phaedo, Socrates offers several arguments for the soul's immortality, but his central message is that the philosopher who has lived justly need not fear death. This freedom from the fear of death enables Socrates to maintain his moral principles even when faced with execution, exemplifying the ultimate form of moral autonomy. Political freedom and civil disobedience. Socrates' relationship with Athenian democracy reveals a complex understanding of political freedom that transcends simple allegiance to democratic or oligarchic systems. Critique of democratic freedom. While Socrates participated in Athens' democratic institutions, serving in the assembly and accepting the authority of its laws, he frequently criticized democratic conceptions of freedom. In Republic, Plato has Socrates describe how excessive democratic freedom eventually undermines itself. The excess of liberty, whether in states or individuals, seems only to pass into excess of slavery. And so tyranny naturally arises out of democracy, and the most aggravated form of tyranny and slavery out of the most extreme form of liberty. This critique suggests that freedom understood merely as the absence of constraint, doing whatever one pleases, ultimately leads to its opposite. True political freedom for Socrates requires wisdom and self-restraint, qualities often lacking in democratic decision-making. The social contract and obligation in Crito, when his friend urges him to escape from prison, Socrates articulates a sophisticated view of political obligation based on an implicit agreement between citizen and state. Socrates personifies the laws of Athens, who remind him, "Were we not first your parents, and through us did not your father take your mother and beget you? Tell us, do you find fault with those of us laws that have to do with marriage?" And later, "Are you not breaking the covenants and agreements made with us, which you made under no compulsion or deceit, and under no constraint of time for deliberation?" By choosing to remain in Athens as an adult, Socrates argues, he has implicitly agreed to abide by its laws. This perspective suggests a conception of political freedom as voluntary participation in a community governed by laws, rather than mere absence of constraint. Principled disobedience despite his respect for legal authority, Socrates maintained that moral principles must sometimes override legal obligations. In Apology, he recounts his refusal to participate in the unjust arrest of Leon of Salamis. "When the oligarchy came to power, the 30 summoned me, and ordered me to bring Leon from Salamis. Then I, however, showed again by action, not in word only, that I did not care about death, if that is not too crude a way to put it, but that I did care with all my might not to do anything unjust or impious." Similarly, in his defense speech, Socrates declares that if the court were to release him on condition that he cease philosophizing, he would refuse. "I shall obey the god rather than you." This willingness to disobey unjust commands, even at risk of death, exemplifies Socrates' understanding of freedom as moral autonomy that transcends political authority. The examined life as true freedom, the culmination of Socrates' perspective on freedom, is his famous declaration in Apology that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being, 38a. This statement encapsulates his understanding of true freedom as the capacity to question, to know oneself, and to live according to examined principles. Self-knowledge as liberation for Socrates, the Delphic maxim, "Know thyself," was not merely advice, but the pathway to genuine freedom. Self-knowledge involves recognizing one's ignorance, examining one's values, and understanding one's motivations. Without such self-knowledge, one remains enslaved to unexamined opinions, conventional values, and unconscious desires. In Alcibiades' I, a dialogue whose authenticity is debated but which reflects Socratic themes, Socrates argues that one cannot properly care for oneself without knowing oneself. If we have no knowledge of ourselves, we cannot know what belongs to us. And if we do not know what belongs to us, we cannot know what belongs to our belongings. This process of self-knowledge liberates one from mistaken self-conceptions and enables authentic self-governance. Freedom as rational self-determination. Ultimately, Socratic freedom involves living according to rationally determined principles rather than external pressures or internal impulses. This conception of freedom transcends both political liberty, freedom from external coercion, and license, freedom to do as one pleases. In Gorgias, Socrates argues with Callicles, who equates freedom with the unlimited satisfaction of desires. Socrates counters that such a life is actually a form of slavery to insatiable appetites. True freedom for Socrates involves governing oneself according to reason and virtue, even when doing so requires restraining one's desires. The Socratic alternative, Socrates, offers an alternative vision of freedom that challenges both democratic and oligarchic conceptions prevalent in his time. Against democratic emphasis on collective self-rule through majority decision, Socrates emphasizes the importance of individual self-rule through rational examination. Against oligarchic emphasis on freedom as the privilege of elites, Socrates presents the pursuit of wisdom as open to anyone willing to engage in dialectical inquiry. This Socratic alternative finds its ultimate expression in his response to his death sentence. Rather than compromising his principles to preserve his life or fleeing into exile as many expected, Socrates accepts the verdict of the court while maintaining his moral autonomy. In doing so, he demonstrates that external circumstances, even imprisonment and execution, cannot undermine the internal freedom of the philosopher committed to living according to examined principles. Socrates' legacy, influence on modern thought. Socrates' conception of freedom has profoundly influenced philosophical thought across diverse traditions, from ancient Stoicism to modern existentialism, from political liberalism to contemporary virtue ethics. Stoic freedom. The Stoic philosophers, particularly Epictetus, developed Socrates' insight that true freedom consists in rational self-governance rather than external circumstances. Epictetus, himself a former slave, famously distinguished between what is up to us, our judgments and intentions, and what is not up to us, external events, arguing that freedom consists in focusing our concern on the former. This Stoic conception of freedom as inner autonomy in the face of external necessity draws directly from Socrates' example. Like Socrates facing his execution, the Stoic sage maintains tranquility and self-determination even under oppression or misfortune. Kantian autonomy. Immanuel Kant's ethical theory, with its emphasis on autonomy, self-legislation through reason, bears a strong Socratic influence. For Kant, moral freedom consists in acting according to principles that one could rationally will as universal laws, rather than being driven by inclination or external authority. This Kantian conception of autonomy develops Socrates' insight that true freedom involves governing oneself according to rational principles rather than being ruled by desires or social conventions. Both Socrates and Kant reject heteronomy, allowing one's will to be determined by something other than reason, as a form of unfreedom. Political liberalism and civil disobedience. Socrates' complex relationship with Athenian law, respecting its authority while reserving the right to disobey unjust commands, anticipates modern liberal conceptions of civil disobedience. Henry David Thoreau, whose essay Civil Disobedience has influenced figures from Gandhi to Martin Luther King Jr., explicitly invokes Socrates as a model of principled resistance to unjust laws. Similarly, John Stuart Mill's defense of intellectual freedom in On Liberty echoes Socratic themes. Mill argues that the free exchange of ideas, including the right to question conventional wisdom, is essential to both individual development and social progress, a position that resonates with Socrates' practice of dialectical inquiry. Existentialist authenticity. Existentialist philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre developed Socrates' emphasis on self-examination into a conception of authentic existence. Kierkegaard, who viewed himself as a modern Socrates, emphasized the importance of subjective truth, not merely knowing principles intellectually, but living them passionately. Sartre's famous claim that existence precedes essence, that humans have no predetermined nature but must create themselves through their choices, extends the Socratic project of self-determination to a metaphysical level. For both Socrates and existentialists, freedom involves taking responsibility for defining oneself through one's choices rather than accepting external definitions. Contemporary virtue ethics. The revival of virtue ethics in contemporary philosophy, led by thinkers like Alasdair MacIntyre and Martha Nussbaum, draws significantly on Socrates' integration of knowledge, virtue, and freedom. These philosophers reject both deontological emphasis on rules and consequentialist focus on outcomes in favor of character development and the pursuit of flourishing, themes central to Socratic ethics. Nussbaum's capabilities approach to human development, which emphasizes positive freedom to function in various human ways, resonates with Socrates' concern for the cultivation of human excellence through philosophical inquiry. Contemporary implications. Socrates in the modern world. Socrates' conception of freedom offers valuable insights for addressing contemporary challenges in ethics, politics, education, and digital culture. Freedom in the age of information. In an era of information overload, misinformation, and algorithmic manipulation, Socrates' emphasis on critical examination takes on renewed importance. His distinction between knowledge and mere opinion challenges us to develop intellectual self-discipline in navigating the digital landscape. Socrates would likely view much of contemporary information freedom as illusory if it lacks the critical tools to distinguish reliable from unreliable sources, or to recognize when one is being manipulated through persuasive techniques. His dialectical method offers a model for cultivating such critical capacity, questioning assumptions, seeking definitional clarity, and identifying contradictions. Freedom and social media. The social dynamics of platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok raise Socratic questions about the relationship between public opinion, rhetoric, and freedom. These platforms often amplify emotional appeals over reasoned argument, incentivize conformity to group opinion, and reward rhetorical skill over truthfulness, tendencies that Socrates criticized in Athenian democratic discourse. A Socratic approach to social media would emphasize maintaining one's capacity for independent judgment amidst social pressure, questioning viral content rather than simply sharing it, and prioritizing substantive discussion over performative virtue signaling or outrage. Freedom and education. Contemporary education often emphasizes information transmission and career preparation over the development of critical thinking and moral reasoning, priorities that Socrates would question. His model of education through questioning rather than lecturing challenges conventional pedagogical approaches. Socratic education aims not merely at acquiring information, but at transforming the learner's relationship to knowledge, developing intellectual humility, curiosity, and autonomy. This approach is increasingly relevant in a world where factual information is readily accessible, but wisdom remains elusive. Freedom and political polarization. In an era of increasing political polarization, Socrates' willingness to question both democratic and oligarchic orthodoxies offers a model of intellectual independence. His emphasis on pursuing truth rather than winning arguments challenges the competitive discourse that dominates contemporary political debate. Moreover, Socrates' integration of intellectual and moral virtue suggests that freedom requires not only protection of rights, but also cultivation of character. This perspective challenges both progressive emphasis on structural change without moral formation and conservative emphasis on traditional values without critical examination. Freedom and consumer culture. Socrates' critique of freedom as unlimited desire satisfaction speaks directly to contemporary consumer culture, which often equates freedom with the capacity to fulfill ever-expanding wants. His emphasis on self-mastery and moderation challenges the assumption that more choices and greater consumption necessarily enhance freedom. A Socratic perspective suggests that consumer culture may actually diminish freedom by fostering dependency on external goods for satisfaction and by promoting unreflective desire rather than examined choice. True freedom